So of all the places we could have gone racing, you chose SVRA, which is kind of like the black tie set, have cocktails, wave each other by on the racetrack. Not really.
Well, you do that in regional. You wave the guy by and then you go have a cocktail. It's never my fault.
Yeah, well,
But I do appreciate a nice roll cage.
it seems like the Corvette is just the bare frame now, and the rest of the chassis is built up from that roll cage.
The roll cage is really, I mean, it's there to protect the driver, but it's also the skeleton of the whole car.
Originally, vintage race cars, the cages weren't substantial. Sometimes as minimal as just simply a bar above the driver's head. In a crash, a lot of guys got killed in the 60s. So the roll cage is one item that SVRA has said, we're going to leave that open to you. Safety comes first. So there's two reasons we're building a pretty substantial cage in this car. One is driver safety. The second is torsional rigidity. We're able to triangulate the cage so the frame doesn't twist in the corners. Well, getting back to driver safety, there's a few things that a lot of guys, when they build a cage, really don't pay attention to. One is the driver compartment.
How are those door bars now?
Lots of room here. One, you want to have room to drive, turn the wheel without hitting your elbow on the corner of the cage. Shift, make sure that the cross tubes aren't impeding your shifting. Secondly, and probably most importantly, if you do get in a crash, you want to make sure that the tubes around your head are far enough away. How about the head? The cage is way above.
Oh, yeah. You've got a good 6 inches or so above your head.
Okay. One of the problems with the Corvette suspension in the back is as the car comes into a hard corner that you have to brake aggressively with, the whole body wants to roll down on the nose, the back end wants to go up. So what happens is the rear suspension goes into droop, and because of the geometry of how the trailing arm is, where it's attached, what happens is the car starts to toe out. So when you're braking hard, the car actually wants to dart around in the back end because both wheels are actually towed out.
The Corvette has an inherent problem with its rear suspension because it has a transverse spring. That is a spring that goes side to side. As the car goes up and down and the spring flexes, it does funny things to how the angle of the tire is. We use a heavier spring on the rear of the Corvette to help limit the amount of deflection on the spring. Now when we use the heavy spring, we have to control the amount of energy in that spring, and to do that, we use a good high-quality shock that will control the compression and the rebound.
Yeah, we can increase the compression rate on the front shocks and the rebound rate on the rear shocks, which is going to help slow down that transition of the car, but you got to be very, very careful that if you get too much rebound, you'll be unloading the rear tires too. So there's a real fine line. We can use the shocks to try and crutch the system, but we still got a problem here. Like I was saying, we can use that more initial toe to start with to try and work around this problem.
So let's talk about motors. Big block Chevrolet, that's the whole reason behind the L88 then, right?
Yeah, we make big power on the thing. Mike's building the motor, and I mean, it's gonna be nasty.
Road racing is one of the most demanding forms of motorsports. It requires the absolute best in parts that we can get so that the engine will live through the season. With this particular engine, one of the contributors was Calais crankshaft. They give us a gun-drilled crank that's very light, some H-beam forged 4340 rods, and they neutral balance and internal balance it so that the engine will run smooth at a very high RPM. As well, we had Diamond Pistons designed the pistons for us. For valve train, we worked with Comp Cams down in Memphis, and they supplied us a solid roller camshaft up over 700 lift to pick the camshaft for this particular combination. How it works is we take our airflow research head, we mount it on our flow bench with the intake manifold on. That gives us real numbers, what the intake port can actually flow. Once we have those numbers, we talk to the engineers down at Comp Cams, and they custom designed this roller cam for this application. We're also using Comp Cams springs, retainers, titanium retainers, locks, and a stud girdle to keep it all together. Up top, we have to use for this particular class of dual plane intake manifold, which actually steps the numbers down quite a bit. And then we also have on top, we have an AED custom carburetor. Now, you don't just throw something like this together. To get it together, you have to do what we call a pre-assembly, which means we're going to dummy assemble. We're going to put the block, the crank, a piston and rod assembly. We're going to wind it to top dead center. We're going to measure how far it is down on the bore, and if necessary, deck the block as well. You're going to check your piston and valve to make sure the valves aren't going to crash into the piston. If all that is good, you've got your camshaft timed and so on, then you can actually clean everything and put it together. Once the engine's all assembled and ready to go, then we'll install it on our engine dyno. The reason why you use the engine dyno is, A, you want to make sure that the engine's not going to break once it's in the car, and as well, once you're assured that everything's working properly, the next thing you're going to do is tune it on the dyno.
More and more dealerships are buying this machine. It's called Motor Check, and essentially what it is an oil analysis machine. You see, the science behind the thing involves analysis of metals, and what this thing is actually burn a bit of oil and then analyze what comes out of it. You simply put an oil sample into the thing. Now, what we've done is we've drawn some oil out of Peter's race engine. We've also drawn some oil out of the truck motor that we're driving down to Watkins Glen. And the whole idea is that if it finds a material from an air filter, it knows it's got a bad air filter. If it finds material that might be associated with a bearing, then it knows to check for the bearings. So a used car outfit would analyze the oil of a car coming in to try to judge the condition of the motor.
Well, depending where you're going to race, the rules will be different. SVRA has very distinct rules on transmissions. Obviously, the way we go through M22s, there's not enough left in the world for us guys to compete. So they said, okay, you can go with a T10. Well, the standard T10, good transmission, but not as good as a straight cut gear transmission. So for a 150-pound weight penalty, we're allowed to run a T101, great transmission. Now, Tex has just come out with this SR1, which again is a great transmission, straight cut gears. The only difference is the shifter, instead of being on the side, is actually on top, which allows us to get the driver's seat closer to the center of the car, which makes it that much safer again. Now, as far as clutch, let's face it, the motors today are making 650 horsepower. A standard clutch just isn't going to cut it. So what we're running now is triple disc clutches, and you can see by the size of them, they're tiny clutches compared to what you're used to, but they're a single or they're a double or triple disc clutch. What happens is all this weight is much less than a standard flywheel and clutch assembly, so the motor will spin up that much faster, and it'll spin that much faster down when you're hitting the brakes and going into the corner.
What about brakes on that Corvette? You've got a huge motor, a completely built chassis, and really, Corvette brakes.
But as far as brakes, rims, suspension, tires, they want it to look, period. Phil Schmidt makes these vintage Trans Am wheels, and they're super lightweight, and they have the exact look. And again, I mean, it's a vintage race car. You want them to look just like they did back in '69. So, I mean, it's stock rotor, stock caliper, stock A-arms. Got to run a 15-inch wheel in the good years.
With a 15-inch wheel and all of that put together in that same package, I mean, isn't it way out of balance? Isn't it hard to drive those things? You never used to brake anyway, right? Speaking of bodies, when the Corvette body came in, it looked like crap. Now it looks great. What happened with it?
Well, again, we want it to look period correct. So we got those F-Greg headlights, the Le Mans style lights. Yeah. This guy makes them. They're killer. They look exactly like the original. Got the L88 flares on it, L88 hood. We got a brand new body from the thing. You can buy it all that way. If you ever drive it and crash it, then I can fix it.
So all of the detail work that went into the car, very short space of time, but you got a lot of things done to make it look like
yeah, because I mean, we had to powder coat the chassis. Normally we don't, but I mean, it turned out just awesome. And on a race car, it's tough as nails, so it'll stand up. And then the body, we did all the modifications, the flares and all that sort of stuff. They got to be molded in, but even that, the Zeus fasteners, like to fasten the body down so we can remove the front clip, make it easier to work on. And then the paint scheme, I'm coming up with different colors that work. And the guy's got to lay down the graphics and decide what we're going to do.
We finally arrived to Watkins Glen, only about 3 hours behind schedule. We figure we only have about an hour to go through tech, so we quickly unload the car. Everybody's helping, especially Tom.
Vintage racing is characterized by huge diversity. And for this SVRA contest, there are over 500 cars to be inspected. So needless to say, tech is going to be very busy. Towards the end of the inspection, the chief of tech drops by. And after all, he's the chief of tech. He's duty-bound to find something.
Let's take a look.
It was a whole weekend ago. There's more of the story than you written.
What do you call that little spoiler there? That's something you made in your shop, or?
Buy them.
Which one? That Heckler or one of the?
Having not raced at the Glen for 7 years, I must admit I was a little nervous going out for my first session. With a new and untested car, the first couple of laps were occupied checking the gauges and feeling out the car.
All right, so that's a 209.5. Last time Peter was here in a Corvette, he did a whole string of 209s and won the race. It's like memory foam. This is the kind of pace that he's used to running. Now, the guys from Legendary think there's a 205 in that car. So does Peter, so do I.
After the first session, I was starting to get comfortable in the car. Now I was ready to get on it. Tom was also starting to feel comfortable.
So when you have an opportunity to socialize and sit around a little bit, talk about these old cars, you're not going to see these anywhere else.
We had a talk with our buddy at TrackMate.
We could see a few opportunities, such as the toe of the boot, where he was going in a little deep, braking too hard, and then he was having to feather the throttle as he went through the boot, wasn't getting on it for that long uphill straight. Every session out, we can now see he's pulling a second or two out.
The next session, we were the fastest car on the track.
All right, Friday afternoon, second official time session. We're down to 206s now. It's great to be at a historic track like Watkins Glen during the day, but there's also real fun at nighttime.
Welcome to SVRA Watkins Glen. This is the third year of this being the largest vintage event in the country, and I want to thank all of you for coming. On the pace lap, once the cars form up side by side, I want your car, unless you're on the pole, to be approximately 1 car length behind the car in front of you. You don't have to be right on the bumper, approximately 1 car length. If you hold back to try to get a run on the start, or if you hold back for whatever other reason, we will black flag you on the first lap. And Jack reminds me that this weekend, as always, we will be checking weights, displacements, brakes, and transmission.
Now, normally a race car driver has time to reflect and prepare before a race. Many drivers take a couple of hours, but in this case, Peter hasn't had 30 seconds. It's straight from the paddock into the car, and it's go time. Now, this would be a good race to win because for the feature, starting in front of these very fast Corvettes would be preferable. And of course, there are many threats from the rest of the Group 6 field. Always competitive, always very fast. It's one of the reasons that SVRA fans tend to line the fences when these big boys hit the track. Peter's luck had definitely changed. The car worked beautifully in the qualifying race and he was able to win it. Immediately following that, the top 10 cars get hauled into tech.
We were feeling pretty smug that our problems were now behind us. But we still spent the morning doing a nut and bolt, checking for any leaks, going over the car from one end to the other. Everything looked good, so now we could relax and just wait for the race.
Just before the guys go up to the false grid for the feature race, unbelievable. Peter's strategy was to get away as quickly as possible, knowing with certainty that the oil temperature would become critical. After 2 laps, Peter has a comfortable gap and begins to short shift the car to keep the revs down and perhaps keep the oil temperature down as well. With one eye in the rearview mirror and the other on the oil temperature gauge, Peter is in maintenance mode. By the last lap, one of those other Corvettes was closing in fast, but it was the last lap, and the engine held up to the punishment.
Felt really good to win the race after all the teething problems we had with the oil coolers. All the guys at Legendary Motor Car put a huge effort into building this car.